Less of a session on retrenchment. So retrenchment is about reducing costs. Now there's various methods of retrenchment, and they include reducing output. Less output means less you need in terms of raw materials or components or perhaps even promotional activities, and that will allow you to reduce your costs. You might want to look to reduce staff size. Reducing staff size means you're able to reduce your labour costs. Reduce the product portfolio that you have. Having less products, perhaps you might find that one particular product is unprofitable, so you might want to reduce it from your product portfolio, and therefore you are reducing costs, and that is a form of retrenchment. In a similar vein, it might be that you're looking to reduce the countries that you operate within, and by doing that you are reducing the losses from a particular country being unprofitable. Retrenchment is a strategic change, but why would you want to retrench? Well, maybe you want to leave an unprofitable market because it has a low return on capital employed. You might want to leave a market due to an economic downturn, perhaps to reduce diseconomies of scale to become more efficient. It could be that you suffer from diseconomies of scale, which means you might have a higher average cost per unit than you want, that is compared to the minimum efficient scale, the lowest that it can be. Those diseconomies of scale could be, for instance, coordination issues, it could be communication issues, it could be management issues, and all of that, perhaps you could solve it by retrenching. Perhaps to solve managerial issues, it could be, or communication issues, it could be to reduce a particular staff to allow you to reduce your diseconomies of scale. It might be that you want to focus on core competencies due to a loss of market share. Perhaps you have a new rival and you've decided the way to compete with the new rival is to focus on your core competencies. So what's the problem with retrenchment? Well, firstly, if you decide to retrench, you may lose the gains from economies of scale. It could be that you lose technical economies of scale, you lose purchasing economies of scale, or you lose managerial economies of scale. In that latter case, if you were to make some managers redundant. And clearly, if you lose economies of scale, that means that you are becoming more inefficient. It's likely that your average cost per unit is increasing, and that could be a problem for the business. The next is that you may lose gains from economies of scope if the product portfolio has been reduced. The next one is that you may lose gains from the experience curve if redundancy is used, and that's led to a loss of corporate knowledge, or I should say corporate experience, and this loss of experience could lead to an increase in the average cost per unit. Essentially, you're moving back up the experience curve as opposed to the orthodox way of moving down it as you become more experienced. The next is that it may reduce motivation for your existing employees if retrenchment has been through redundancies. Finally, retrenchment could have a wider impact on stakeholders such as suppliers. They might become a bit jittery if you have retrenched. They don't know what that means for them. Also customers, it may have a perception from customers that you are perhaps not operating a particular product or you're not operating a particular region, and that could have negative associations. What's the impact of retrenchment on functional areas? Well, when you think about functional areas, you think about marketing, operations, HR, and of course finance. And you might want to associate with the key terms within those functional areas. So it's marketing, you want to think about market share, sales growth, brand image, brand awareness. If you're thinking about operations, you want to think about efficiency, average unit costs, labour productivity, capacity, CAPU, quality. HR could be labour turnover, absenteeism, labour productivity, and of course motivation. And if it's finance, you'll be thinking about profit, costs, return on capital employed, revenue growth, cash flow, and gearing. So let's look at each of the areas specifically. Start with finance. So if we think about the impact of retrenchment on finance, it might be that we want to consider firstly cash flow. So the impact of retrenchment on cash flow is that does the business need emergency sources of finance? Perhaps they have cash flow issues. If so, retrenchment may help improve that cash flow. It could be that you've retrenched, it means you have less costs, and you've improved your cash flow as a result. Or perhaps the retrenchment generates surplus cash flow, and you can use that surplus or excess cash flow to help pay off your debts, And if you pay off your debts, your long-term debts, then that will reduce the gearing of the business. And that could be a good thing, especially if interest rates have or are expected to increase in the near term. Secondly, cost cutting. If the business is retreating, so leaving an international market, then they may have less focus on exchange rate fluctuations because it's less important to you if you are leaving international markets. So therefore, obviously, exchange rate fluctuations or exchange rates are very important to your sales, to suppliers, to wages, and the fact that you've eliminated that and you don't need to manage it so much, that may help you in supporting your cost cutting. Let's move on to the next functional area. So operations. So operations, economies of scale. So it's very likely retrenchment is going to have an impact on economies of scale or on diseconomies of scale. But the key to whether it produces economies of scale or diseconomies of scale will be dependent on the positioning to the minimum efficient scale. Now, if we bring up here an average cost curve, you can see we've got cost per unit on the y-axis and output on the x-axis. The minimum efficient scale, MES, that is where you get the lowest cost per unit. If you move to the right of MES, so you increase your output, you move to the right of MES towards perhaps B, then that leads to diseconomies of scale. And of course, diseconomies of scale leads to a higher cost per unit. And if you move to the left of MES, perhaps you've retrenched and you've reduced your output, then that may lead to higher cost per unit. And of course, that makes you more inefficient as a result of losing those economies of scale. Now, the key thing is where you start. So if you were to start at the MES and then you retrenched, so you reduced your output, well, clearly that means you're losing economies of scale and it looks like it's going to lead to a higher cost per unit. However, if you were suffering from diseconomies of scale and you started at B and then you moved towards the MES as you reduced your output because of retrenchment and you moved from B to MES, well, you can see there that actually does the opposite. It leads to your cost per unit falling in that case. So the key is it depends on the position of the minimum efficient scale to your original spot. So that's a key point there for retrenchment. The next point is capacity and capacity utilization. So if a business has multiple sites operating at low capacity utilization, then some of these could be closed down to reduce the capacity, but increase the overall capacity utilization, the CAPU, overall for the business. And that would make the overall business more efficient. So you've got loads of sites operating with low CAPU, close a few down, and then look to distribute them towards the remaining sites, and that should help improve your capacity utilization. And remember, if you improve your capacity utilization, that makes you more efficient. If you're more efficient, it means your average unit costs come down, and that's a good thing because it's reduced your costs. Let's move on to the next area. So the impact of retrenchment on functional areas. So it might be in the case of marketing that you would want to adapt your marketing mix. If the business is retrenching, then they may want to reduce the product portfolio. You could use different pricing strategies, change distribution channels, or reduce the total spend on the promotional mix because you're looking to cut your costs. Or it could be that you allocate your promotional mix in a different way, maybe towards cheaper forms of promotion. Human resources is the next functional area. So clearly, if you're thinking about retrenchment and human resources, I think the first place you'd go is redundancies, because that is the way you'd probably retrench. And if the business is retrenching, then they may want to reduce the staff size. This may impact the organizational structure depending on which type of staff have been made redundant. Key thing there is which type of staff. Perhaps it's middle management, and if it's middle management, then that could see and be very much associated with delayering, leading to a flatter structure. Flatter structure could mean that you have shorter chains of command and wider spans of control. Also, recruitment and selection. If you're looking to retrench, it might be that you're looking to reduce staff sizes, and that might mean that you're going to have a recruitment freeze. Motivation issues. So redundancies may mean that you're going to have motivation issues amongst the existing staff, those who remain. And you'll want to avoid having higher absenteeism rates, having higher staff turnover. So you might need to put in place some financial or non-financial methods of motivation.